India's data protection regime or the data protection bill or personal data protection bill. It has been talked about since 2017. There have been conversations, there have been drafts, there have been redrafts, and so on. Where is it and when can we expect it? And also, how would it make an impact or what kind of challenges would it create for corporates in India? How are corporates looking at it and how will they fulfill the demands and needs of the new bill? And also, where and how will the resources or skills be found? All this and more in conversation with none other than India's leading privacy advisor, Supratim Chakraborty, who's also the partner at Khaitan and Company and actively engaged involved in framing drafting of personal data protection bill in India. Let's go and talk to him.
Hello, and welcome to the Fit for Privacy podcast with Punit Bhatia. This is the podcast for those who care about their privacy. Here, your host, Punit Bhatia, has conversations with industry leaders about their perspectives, ideas, and opinions relating to privacy, data protection, and related matters. Be aware that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are not legal advice. Let us get started.
So here we are with Supratim Chakraborty. Welcome, Supratim.
Thank you. Thanks, Punit.
It's a pleasure to have you. And as we talk about the Indian data protection landscape or regime, let me ask you something from a European data protection regime. We all have heard about GDPR, but what's the one word that comes to your mind when you think of the GDPR?
Let me give a small story from my own practice and career, which will make you understand how I perceive this from India. So GDPR came into effect on 25th of May 2018. On 24th of May, a gentleman came to my office and belonged to a company who have some EU interface, and the boss would have said that, listen, from tomorrow there is some new law coming into effect called GDPR. Please reach out to our lawyers and see what is needed to be done. So the person comes with two documents with me. One is a privacy policy, the other is the terms of use of the website, and says that, listen, my boss sent to me, I just want you to quickly look at these, make minimal changes. I will upload it tonight, your changed version, and tomorrow onwards we are GDPR compliant.
Wow.
So that's the perception of GDPR with which we started, and that's the journey. I think we have matured as a country, as an ecosystem. I had coffee that day with the gentleman and said that, listen, this is exactly what the law does not want you to do. No lip service, please. Okay, you have to actually put the processes and systems in place in order to talk about it to the outside world and put it in your privacy policy, etc. Just to make you understand from where we are coming, the background that we have actually seen, and from there to here, it has been a long journey. Justice Sri Krishna Committee, you'd be aware, was formed in August 2017. I attended almost all of his consultation meets across the country, physically went and attended to understand how our civil society, people, businesses, they are reacting to the law, the draft legislation at that time, and what are the inputs that they're providing. Okay, so I had a very good experience, and I realized from there to now we have definitely matured as an ecosystem. Sorry, long-winded answer, but I hope I could give some flavor to you.
No, it's definitely useful and worthwhile on how people perceive it. But then, coming from that mindset, when people think legal or law compliance is about policy and some terms and conditions, to the need of process and everything, and now that India is intending to, and of course we know for last 3 or 4 years, or maybe now 5 years, I think that there has been a draft, a revised draft, left, right, but still there is an intention to have a law, and there is a concern amongst common businessmen. Would it impede business? Because some say we are not in Europe and we cannot afford it. And there's another party also saying the culture, the mindset of people is very different. Data is not as appreciated as commodity, places where it sells. And then there is the other part. We need to be equal in terms of global standards in digital society, and hence this data protection law is needed. So can you enlighten us on where does this fit in and how is this being foreseen or seen by the government, because you're also in touch with honorable ministers and so on and so forth, and part of those conversations. So help us understand, how does the government see it, how does the society see it, and what kind of change is being expected?
Right. So I think, Punit, one of the reasons you would have observed that we had to take back the old draft, and then the new draft has been now released and consultations were invited, is that the government perhaps thought that we should make our law less compliance heavy. We have been having a bull run as far as our startup ecosystem is concerned. We were having unicorns every other day. So the idea appears to be that innovation should not get hampered because under the burden of compliances. At the same time, it's important to protect the privacy of individuals. So right now, the approach seems to be a middle of the road approach where individuals' data is protected. At the same time, there is an endeavor to see that we continue to have innovation, growth, and it should truly be a decade of India, like the government is perceived. If you look at it from a business perspective, I think the present draft has been welcome because it is a light touch draft. It is not very heavy on compliance. Of course, a lot has been left to further rule making, etc., and it has to be seen how it will unfold. But right now, I think largely the business ecosystem has welcomed the draft, the latest draft of the data protection bill.
That's good to know. And is there an indicative, tentative timeline? I know timelines are very difficult to predict, especially when it comes to laws and passing of laws. But is there any indication, when do we get it? 23, 24?
No, I think 23 seems to be, but definitely a good timeline that we can think of. The plan, of course, is to have this in the budget session of the parliament. There is also another law in the making, which is called the Digital India Act, which intends to completely replace the present day Information Technology Act of 2000. The government believes that it has run its course. It is now kind of not keeping pace with the technological developments. Therefore, probably the idea is to now have a new set of laws. So the Digital India Act, the DPDP bill, the Digital Personal Data Protection Bill, and a few more. So all of this will finally become the total ecosystem for as digital laws of the country.
Okay, that's good to know, because that revamp, that shift is needed, because we are in a new world. We are not in 90s. We are now in 2020s, and it's lot has changed. A lot has changed. So in that context, one of the things and one of the challenges we faced in Europe was, it was a big shift from 95 directive to the GDPR. And if we go that, companies were not ready. Companies were struggling because, for example, data deletion, that was not in the culture. It was data accumulation that was in the culture. How is the corporate landscape in India right now, especially the big corporates? Because there is all that detail around data is being sold and all that, but then there is the seriousness around corporates, and there's corporate governance. What do they see, what do they have in place already from privacy compliance? Because most of these companies are operating globally, and when they're operating globally, they have done some action or more action in context of the GDPR compliance, CCPA compliance, and even Singapore and other compliance as well.
Right. No, a great question, Punit. So the way I have observed is larger organizations which already have interface with the European Union or other mature jurisdictions which have got mature laws, they have already started complying, or at least are in the process of complying. Okay, they're kind of putting in systems in place, and therefore they have that comfort that whatever comes up in India, probably we will be 80-90% there. Of course, there's a delta check that has to be done, because there are some Indian nuances which are there in every version of the law. It has been there, and it will continue to be there, but they are kind of in a better spot. Then you have another set of companies which do not have interface, but kind of proactive to see that can we emulate, can we imbibe some of these gold standards and see that we are future ready. Okay, so we have been having some companies who are doing sessions for their internal people every year to keep pace with the understanding. The GDPR experience had shown us that those 2 years which were given for preparation was not sufficient. Okay, definitely there was more time which was required, and some people, I'm sure you would be aware, woke up last moment and wanted to do everything. So I think it was a good learning exercise for India as well, because from the ring side, there were a lot of organizations who observed what was happening in the EU, and took some lessons. Also, there were some, I think, mistakes, some issues which were highlighted when GDPR was getting implemented, and from there also there were few learnings which I saw that our organizations here took a leaf from. For example, I'll tell you one. Some organizations in the EU perhaps had dashboards where individuals could really go and put in a request for their data and take out data. That also tantamounted to some data thefts in certain cases. Okay, so people who were not the real owners of the data actually requested and got information. So these lessons, I think, were well learned by some of the Indian organizations who were trying to do similar things here. And I think therefore it'll be a good space for India and Indian organizations. When our law comes into play, we will have some history, background, knowledge from GDPR and other laws.
That's always the case. When you're coming later, you can learn lessons, and that's the opportunity you have. But you mentioned 2 years was not enough, and you mentioned more time is needed by companies to adapt, adopt, or be compliant or be ready. I think compliant is overrated because no one is compliant with because business keeps changing. But you can be ready to do business. So, how much time can we expect in the Indian data protection law when it comes live? Will there be time, like 2 years or something?
So I think in the present version of the bill, unfortunately, there is no sunrise period which has been mentioned. And almost all organizations, industry associations I am aware of have made this request that at least put forth some clear timeline which would be made available. What the government has generally informed is that time would be provided. In the past, what we have seen is around 18 to 24 months has been the thought process, in the previous versions of the bill, etc. So we can at least expect something in the range of, say, 12 to 24 months. And there could also be a phased rollout of the law.
That's good. That's also essential, and that's also needed because the companies you mentioned who are operating globally, they maybe don't need time. They are 80% compliant. But the companies, and there are many, many, many companies like that, and also the small, medium sector, they would need time, and they would not only need time to implement processes and systems, but to change the mindset. And that is where the real effort is, create that
Absolutely.
culture of privacy. And when we talk about the culture of privacy, at times we say that the culture in Asia, like the Chinese came up with the Chinese data protection bill, and there was a lot of skepticism, especially about the principles and values. Is transparency going to be there? Is accountability going to be there? And that's sometimes same mentioned in other parts of the Asian region also. How do you see the culture, overall culture? I'm not talking the legal landscape, and will it play a part in data protection being real? And I give you a anecdote or an example. We talk about copyright very emphatically as persons who know the law, but then there's a joke saying, someone in some Asian country was saying, here's a CD, do you have copyright? Oh yes, I can copy it, it says copyright, so you have the right to copy. So there is that misinterpretation of facts, misinterpretation of law. How do you see that being a challenge or not?
Right. So I think you're absolutely right. See, privacy does not come naturally to us. And therefore, it is something that has to be taught and retaught and retaught. Okay. Like I was mentioning, for some of the organizations, this is now almost a yearly or a half yearly event that all people need to get into a room and actually have a session which is discussing about privacy. Having said that, this is a top down effect what we have seen in organizations. Okay, if you have the buy-in of the top leadership, it becomes relatively easy. And it is not about, say, the top few people who needs to get educated about it. Till the last person on the floor gets educated, your job is not done. So when we talk about culture of privacy, I think there has been some shift which we can clearly see, but a lot needs to be done, and at every level. For example, I have spent some time teaching primary school teachers about privacy, especially teachers who are there teaching IT and computers to students. So unless at the grassroots level you have a concerted effort, it will not become, it will not fructify.
But I think, given the hierarchical culture, and you mentioned the tone from the top, if in India you can set the tone from the top, things will follow sooner than later, because when you have a law, the tone from the top would also change, in my view.
Right. No, and I'll jut in there. So, Puneet, if you look at the present law, what it has tried to do is give a framework largely, and it is paving way for organizations to do things in house largely, or through industry associations, and in a self-regulated manner. If we are able to pick this up responsibly, I think it will be a great one. Then we don't need laws or hard regulations to call out everything. If you look at Indian regulations right now, that is what they are doing, trying to do in a very concerted manner. They're trying to lean towards self-regulation, self-regulatory bodies, etc. Okay, that's one. Secondly, it is also decriminalizing a lot of laws in order to see that you take the law in the right spirit, at least the ones which can be decriminalized. Okay, here also, in some of the previous versions of the bill, there were elements of imprisonment, etc., which has been done away with. Of course, the penalty quantum has been increased significantly, and up to Indian rupee 500 crore could be the impact. But otherwise, there is a push towards organizations to kind of self-regulate themselves, create their own boundaries, and be compliant.
I think that's an interesting aspect, because the GDPR, more and more people are realizing, is also a framework legislation. You got to make your own interpretation, and that's the right way to inculcate, that's the right way to promote innovation rather than suffocate innovation and kill innovation, which is not the idea of a law. The idea of a law is to create a society in which people are protected and business can flourish, not one or the other. So if we look at that, there's also some concern, especially when in sitting in Europe, we look at the US friends, we say there's a lot of freedom being given to the government in terms of access to data. And when I read the last version, I know there were in so many versions. In fact, I even chose to write a book on the first draft and realized that was not a very smart idea. You need to wait for the final version. So there's a concern in context of Indian situation also, that the government may keep access, and that provision, that exception is being granted to the state and to the government, and even other situations. How do you see that? Would it create an issue when it comes to asking maybe adequacy from EU, because that's also one of the objectives of this initiative?
Right. No, excellent question again. But let me tell you that even today, when you look at laws of almost any jurisdictions, I'm sure there will be laws where there would be provisions for governmental access to information. And this goes back in our context to the Indian Telegraph. From there onwards, there have been avenues under the Information Technology Act, there are avenues, etc., etc. So it's not that today it is not there. Now, the question is, the future laws that we are creating, do they have enough insulations or safeguards when we are talking about access to such data? And here, I think the avenue of feedback was kind of well utilized. I'm aware that there are several participants who have written where nuts and bolts are required to be still fitted. Otherwise, what will happen, Puneet, is that the moment this law comes into effect, probably it will be challenged in a court of law through a writ, and things would then have to be altered. So I think from the government's perspective also, it will be a judicious one wherever the gaps are observed still, to put in the nuts and bolts and ensure that you have a legislation which can smoothly run.
And do you think it'll be sufficient for India to get adequacy from EU? Because I'm curious to understand. Let's put it like that.
So right now, Puneet, if you've observed, with our G20 leadership, etc., all of this, the move is towards a global player status. Okay.
Okay.
And that's very clear if you observe all the changes that are happening right now. If you look at the provision which has been now put in the context of cross-border data transfer, it has talked about free transferability in a way, with of course some terms and conditions, with some whitelisted countries. So the idea is there right now that we need to have these reciprocity with certain countries, and probably to move towards this adequacy standards, wherein at least with our important trading jurisdictions, we are able to equate the standards and have free transferability.
That's good to know, because if it goes in that direction, it'll help everyone, because we don't want another law which kind of restricts, limits, and creates more data sovereignty rather than data exchange, because in a modern world, we would need data exchange facilitated. Now, another thing is, in EU, what we saw was when the GDPR came, a lot of manpower needed to be created, a lot of skill set need to be created. Now in India, usually you have a legal department and that's about it. Even the compliance and other aspects are limited per se, because the amount of legislation that is in India compared to EU or US, it's different, and the culture and the mindset is also different, so compliance is more differently perceived. So is there a provision, is there a perspective, is there a vision to have privacy embedded more as a department or as a function? Like there was a talk about DPO, then there was another term that was being used in India, and then the data, there was a complaints officer, grievance officer. So terms keep changing, but is there provision for manpower inside the company and accountability or self-regulation, as you mentioned earlier, through internal, say, personnel?
So again, I think we'll have to break this into two parts. One is the MNCs, organizations with foreign law interface. They've tried to create some manpower, some departments which are looking at privacy and related aspects. But for most others, right now it is double hatting, and amongst other things in the legal space, they're also trying to understand things in the privacy space. So this has also created a bit of confusion. The confusion has been also created because of the way the law was drafted, redrafted, another version came. So when people prepared, they started getting in some specialized people, or recalibrating, retraining their people. They realized that was not the draft which finally came out, and there was a redraft. So therefore people had to again do a lot of double hatting. It continues right now, but thankfully what we are observing is that organizations are pushing their people to learn more in the privacy space, which was not there a few years back. Right now consciously they are sending their people for training, for courses, etc.
No, that I can definitely vouch for. The amount of traffic, even on our website from India, especially for our courses, is tremendous. Now, that leads me to another question, because usually in Europe and in US, we have skill shortage when it comes to privacy skills. And when I talk to my Indian colleagues, they are also saying that that's the same in India. So on one hand, even without a data privacy law, let's put it like that, I know it's not black and white because there's the IT Act and so on, and there's some form of legislation, but say not a strict GDPR like equivalent law. And with the new law being planned, how will that skill shortage be matched? Because we've seen that in the case of GST, we've seen that in other cases also. Then of course the corporate media comes along, the universities come along, the private sector comes along, and it does get addressed, and then it becomes almost a wave. But how do you address it structurally?
Right, I completely agree. It is not structurally addressed till now. There have been such instances in the past, and we found ourselves lacking till suddenly it became a wave, and then you could find relevant professionals. Right now, I would say because from July August 2017, this process has been on. We have garnered some interest, and like I was mentioning, there is some bit of manpower which has already kind of evolved. And if this law gives about 1 to 2 years of time, probably you will see a lot more quick interest being gained in this space. But considering India as a large country, even that could be, there could be a shortfall. So yeah, you could expect that there'll be an interim phase where there'll be a crunch.
So anyone in university looking for a career, this can be an option, because the law will certainly come in a few months or few years.
Punit, let me tell you, this is an interesting one. I was interviewing some candidates for my own team, and we shortlisted and chose one candidate, and she told me that, sir, I must mention here now that I am selected that I started reading about data privacy protection because you had come to our college once, and that's the first time I heard a lecture on data privacy and protection, and got interested in it. So I think we'll have to all do this, as professionals. It's a small group right now. We'll also have to consciously go out and teach.
Indeed, and I think it's all about creating awareness. And if you create awareness at the university level, when the people are getting in, or even a few years earlier, I think universities, given the trend, would also create data protection related degrees per se in future. That will happen. It's not happening that much, but it will happen. So anyone, any business who's listening to this and wants to have your advice, because sometimes people want advice for free. So let's say one advice you would give them to prepare for the India's data protection bill, what would that one advice be?
See, I think we have been discussing this one point through and through. One, you have to educate your people. That is, I think, the most important thing, okay, which you should, definitely start with. It will take time. The culture of privacy is not there. It takes time to seep into the system. Otherwise, apart from this one point, I would also like to sort of mention that though this draft law looks very simple on the face of it, your requirements pertaining to personal data still remains. So you have to figure out where this personal data resides in your system. So the data mapping exercise, which again takes time, I think you should start doing. There is no substitute. You'll have to ultimately do that, and better get started soon.
So it links back to your original story. Do not come on the last day. Tomorrow the law is coming. Start now. Start becoming aware. Start getting to understand your data, and start working on it. Because the law is coming, doesn't matter when, but you will need to work. That's for certain. And that action you need to start initiating, because it takes more than the time the law will give you.
Absolutely.
And I think at that moment, I would say, thank you so much. It was wonderful. I think a holistic conversation on all aspects related to data protection regime. Of course, we could have gotten into technicals, but I chose the high level. So thank you so much, Supratim, for your time.
Thank you, Punit. It's been really a pleasure speaking in this forum with you. And anyways, happy to speak on this topic anytime. So whenever you feel like, give me a shout.
Pleasure is mine.
Thanks for listening. If you liked the show, feel free to share it with a friend and write a review. If you have already done so, thank you so much. And if you did not like the show, don't bother and forget about it. Take care and stay safe. Fit for Privacy helps you to create a culture of privacy and manage risks by creating, defining, and implementing a privacy strategy that includes delivering scenario-based training for your staff. We also help those who are looking to get certified in CIPPE, CIPM, and CIPT through on-demand courses that help you prepare and practice for certification exam. Want to know more? Visit www.fitforprivacy.com. That's www.fit4privacy.com. If you have questions or suggestions, drop an email at hello@fit4privacy.com. Until next time, goodbye.